All right, everybody, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something I think a lot of folks might not realize affects them directly.
Oh, yeah.
It's education policy.
Hmm.
We're going to be looking at some excerpts from an academic paper, actually. It suggests dissertation topics.
Oh, wow.
Some pretty high-level stuff.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to break it down for you.
Right.
Because I think when we think about education policy, we're like, what is that? Some dusty old documents locked away
Right. Exactly.
in some ivory tower. But the thing is, those policies actually shape the way that we all experience education,
Absolutely.
whether we realize it or not.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's so pervasive that we don't even think about it,
Exactly.
Just sort of like the air we breathe.
Yeah. And we're going to show you how these abstract ideas actually translate into real classrooms and real impact.
Yeah. And I think the big thing to start off with is understanding that policies are more than just words on paper.
Right.
They're the guidelines. They're the rules that determine how schools operate. Everything from how they're funded.
Like how much money they get.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's taught in the classrooms,
Hmm.
how teachers are trained, even like the discipline policies,
Yeah, like so many different facets of education.
all shaped by policy decisions.
Like even down to like what kind of snacks you can have in the vending machines.
Right.
It can be very specific.
Exactly.
I mean, the thing that jumps out to me when I think about policy is funding.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, we all know that schools need money.
Right.
Back in the day, we used to have bake sales and car washes to try to raise money for our schools.
Absolutely.
But we're talking about like serious money here.
Yeah.
We're talking about millions of dollars that are allocated.
Right. And the way that money's allocated can have huge ripple effects.
Right. And I know from this paper that we're looking at that some states have these funding formulas that are like super complicated and they can lead to like huge disparities in how much money different schools get.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it's not even just about the total amount of money. It's about how that money is distributed.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have a state that spends a lot on education overall, but if that money isn't distributed equitably, you're still going to have schools that are struggling.
Right. So like you could have a school in one district that gets thousands of dollars more per student than a school in a different district.
Exactly.
And that's just because of where they live.
Right. And that can translate into so many things, smaller class sizes.
Oh, yeah.
More resources,
Mm-hmm.
better facilities.
Fewer textbooks.
Absolutely. All of that comes down to funding.
Yeah. And so it's not just like the amount of money. It's like how that money is spent and who gets to decide how it's spent.
That's right. And that's where policy comes in,
Yeah.
because these funding formulas are determined by policies that are often made at the state level.
So even though we think about like our local school board having a lot of control, really a lot of it is coming from higher ups.
Absolutely. And a lot of the decisions are made at the state level or even the federal level.
So, okay, funding is a big one.
Uh-huh.
But I know that this paper also talks about curriculum.
Oh, yeah. Curriculum's a huge one.
And I think this is something that everybody can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about the classes that you took in school, the subjects that you loved, the subjects that you hated. Like, who gets to decide what we're learning and how we're learning it?
Right. And it's not always a simple answer, because curriculum choices are influenced by a lot of different factors.
Like what?
Well, you've got political forces at play. You've got social forces.
Mm-hmm.
You've got, different interest groups all weighing in on what they think should be taught in schools.
I mean, you've got like the textbook publishers.
Oh, yeah.
Who have a huge influence.
Absolutely.
And they have their own agendas.
For sure.
Like I remember when I was in school, we had this one history textbook.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so dry and boring. And it just presented like one very narrow view of history.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
can be really problematic because it can give students a very skewed understanding of the world.
Yeah, like whose stories are being told.
Yeah.
And whose stories are being left out.
And that's where the whole idea of representation comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Are we presenting a diverse range of perspectives? Are we giving students a chance to see themselves reflected in the curriculum?
Yeah, and these are all questions that are shaped by policy.
Absolutely, because policies can dictate what content is included in textbooks, what standards teachers have to follow, even like how history is taught. Is it taught as a series of dates and battles?
Right.
Or is it taught as a complex and nuanced story?
Right. And like, what about the arts?
Oh, yeah.
Are we going to prioritize music and art and theater in schools? Or are those going to be the first things to get cut when budgets are tight?
Right. And again, that comes back to those policy decisions.
Yeah. So we've talked about funding, we've talked about curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
but I know there's another big issue that this paper brings up, and that's equity and opportunity.
Oh, yeah. Equity is huge.
Like, how do we make sure that every student, no matter where they live, no matter what their background is, has a fair shot at a quality education.
Right, and that's a really complex issue because it's not just about giving everyone the same thing.
Right.
It's about recognizing that different students have different needs
Mm-hmm.
and that we need to provide different levels of support to make sure everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed.
So are we talking about things like targeted support programs for students who are struggling?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Or early childhood education initiatives to give kids a strong foundation from the very beginning?
Right.
Or maybe even revising standardized testing policies?
All of those things are part of the conversation.
Okay, so there are a lot of different approaches to this.
Yeah.
But I think the key is that we're recognizing that there are these systemic barriers in place
Mm-hmm.
that prevent some students from having the same opportunities as others.
Right, and those barriers can be based on race, socioeconomic status, disability, all sorts of
And
factors.
so these policies are trying to level the playing field.
Exactly. They're trying to create a more equitable system.
Yeah. And this next part is where I think it gets really interesting. Because this paper that we're looking at, it's not just saying, okay, here are all the problems.
Yeah.
It's also saying we need to study how these policies are actually implemented.
Oh, yeah. Implementation is key.
Like what happens when these policies actually hit the ground? How do they play out in schools?
Right, because a policy can look great on paper,
Mm-hmm.
but if it's not implemented effectively, it's not going to have the desired impact.
Right. And this is where I think your experience comes in. Have you ever encountered a policy in a school that just seemed counterproductive
Oh, for sure.
or even harmful?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen examples of that.
Yeah.
Like those zero tolerance discipline policies
Yeah.
that end up suspending kids for really minor infractions, and then those kids end up falling further behind.
Right. And it often disproportionately affects students of color
Exactly.
and students from low-income backgrounds.
And it creates this whole school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And then there are those standardized testing regimes.
Oh, yeah.
That seem to be more about rankings and competition than about actually helping students learn.
Right. It becomes all about teaching to the test.
Yeah. And it just creates so much stress and anxiety for everyone involved.
And it narrows the curriculum
Hmm.
because teachers feel like they have to focus on those tested subjects.
Right. And so the other subjects,
Mhm.
like art and music and PE, they end up getting squeezed out.
Exactly.
So I think the big takeaway here is that education policy matters.
Absolutely.
It's not just some abstract academic exercise. It shapes the educational opportunities that are available to each and every one of us.
It really does.
And I think understanding how these policies work empowers us to become more informed advocates for change.
For sure, because once you understand the system, you can start to see where the levers are,
Mm.
and you can start to push for policies that are more equitable, more effective.
And more responsive to the needs of all students.
Exactly.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Now that you've had this glimpse into the world of education policy, what's one thing that you would change about the education system if you had the power?
That's a great question.
Like what policy would you create to make a real difference?
I encourage everyone listening to really think about that.
Yeah.
Because we all have a stake in this, and we all have a voice.
So do some research. Maybe reach out to your local school board members or your elected officials. Let them know what you think, because your informed perspective can truly make a difference.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often overlooked world of education policy. Keep those minds curious.